On September the 17th, 1931, America's most prolific bank robber, Pretty Boy Floyd, walked into the Sallisaw State Bank in Oklahoma. But today, Pretty Boy wasn't here for the bank's money. The head of the bank greeted Floyd calmly, having known him since a child, and asked him if he was really going to go ahead with it. Floyd smiled and calmly walked into a side office where mortgage papers were kept and threw them all in a pile before setting them on fire. This single action freed thousands of residents of Sallisaw from crippling debt during the Great Depression and from one of the darkest times in America's history. As he emerged from the bank to his getaway car, Pretty Boy Floyd was championed as a hero by a crowd of his family and friends who had gathered outside to cheer him on during the robbery. Although no money was taken, this act was part of a relentless 12-month crime spree which saw him rob over 60 banks in 1931 alone through the heart of Midwest America. This most recent daring act crowned him as public enemy number one and led him to being universally romanticized across America as the Robin Hood of Oklahoma. But if only they knew the full truth about their hero, Pretty Boy Floyd. Hello and welcome to The Last Supper. I'm Jack, the face behind the videos, and admittedly, it's probably a face which is best suited for the radio and should have continued just doing the voiceovers. But if you didn't catch my last community post, I've had a copyright strike against me. As you know, I like to use TV shows and movies and various other clips to help tell the stories of these documentaries that I make. But I can't do that anymore. So this is going to be the new format for the documentaries. I hope you like it and I hope you can get on board. So I've been making documentaries on criminals from the 20s and 30s for quite some time now. And I don't think I've come across one as bloodthirsty as Pretty Boy Floyd. Suspected in 12 murders, 6 of which were law enforcement officers, a direct result of him living by his own mantra that he'd never be taken alive. Pretty Boy Floyd was relentless, ruthless, and I believe the most bloodthirsty bank robber in history. To the public, Floyd hovered somewhere between hero and villain. They knew he stole and killed, yet he also gave away thousands to struggling families, earning their unwavering devotion. In their eyes, Floyd embodied the spirit of the legendary Wild West outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, but with a modern twist. Instead of a 6-shooter and a horse, he wielded a Thompson submachine gun and roared across the Midwest in a Ford sedan, becoming a symbol of defiance and hope for the downtrodden. Floyd is a character who captivated a nation and who countless documentaries have been made on, but having watched them all, I realised that his fascinating and blood-soaked story has never been told in full detail from start to finish until now. From the infamous Kansas City Massacre to his legacy as the last of America's great bank robbers, you'll understand why his name became legend, why he left a dozen widows cursing him to the depths of hell, and why his worshippers never forgot him. So strap in and let's journey back 100 years to Depression-era America to reveal the full, untold story of Charlie Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd. Warning. This video contains themes of violence, death and gang activity. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. All pictures and images are actual images of the subjects and events from this era. Some images are graphic and viewers may find them disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. On a chilly February day in 1904, the rolling green hills of Bartow County, Georgia, witnessed the arrival of Charles Arthur Floyd. Born on February the 3rd, he was the fourth of what would eventually become 8 children in the hard-working Floyd family. His parents, Walter Lee Floyd and Minnie Eccles, were deeply rooted in the traditions of the South, embodying the grit and resilience of generations of farmers. Life on the Floyd family farm was far from indulgent. Charles, along with his siblings, grew up in a household where everyone contributed. Chores on the farm and in the home were non-negotiable, and evenings often concluded with lessons from the Bible, guided by their devout mother, Minnie. Young Charlie, as he was affectionately called, tackled his responsibilities without complaint. He had a good-natured spirit that shone through in his humour, often telling jokes or orchestrating harmless pranks to bring laughter to his siblings and lighten the demands of their daily workload. Walter Floyd, a man of unyielding determination, constantly saw opportunities to provide for his growing family. In 1911, lured by the promise of better fortunes in Oklahoma, which had recently joined the Union, he packed up his wife and children and journeyed westward. The Floyd family settled in Sequoyah County near the rolling green Cookson Hills. Their new home, a modest wooden house on the outskirts of Hanson, became the base for their tenant farming enterprise. Renting land, the Floyds cultivated cotton, corn, and other crops, embodying the industrious spirit of their patriarch. Walter, never one to idle, took on various seasonal jobs for the county to supplement the family's income. His relentless work ethic bore fruit, and the Floyds soon emerged as one of the more successful families in the area, prosperous enough to own an automobile, a luxury few could afford at the time. The Cookson Hills of Oklahoma, steeped in tradition, remained largely unchanged from the days when the land was part of the Choctaw Indian Territory. Resourcefulness was a way of life for its inhabitants, and when resources ran short, they found other means. Many families turned to moonshining, crafting illegal liquor in makeshift stills tucked away in barns, corn cribs, and basements. This moonshine served as a cheaper alternative to the costly spirits produced by legal distilleries. The trade became known as running liquor, and it was a way of life that provided extra income for struggling families. The Floyd family, like many of their neighbours, embraced in the practice. Charlie, still a teenager, joined his brothers in peddling moonshine through the tiny, smoke-hazed hamlets scattered across the Cookson Hills' rugged landscape. For the local folk, this wasn't a crime, it was survival. It was a means to pay rent, buy shoes for the kids, and keep food on the table. Around 1915, the Floyd family relocated to Aikens, drawn by its richer soil and better opportunities for farming. Aikens was a little town that used to be called Sweettown, as it was famous for the amount of molasses that the town produced. In Aikens, they became even more self-sufficient, raising most of their food, including potatoes, apples, and peaches, and canning their vegetables for colder months. They cured their own meat, rendered lard, ground cornmeal, and grew sorghum to make molasses. Walter Floyd's industriousness paid off, and he eventually bought a truck and earned extra income hauling freight between Sallisaw and Aikens. Eventually, he achieved a measure of financial stability, opening up a general store in Aikens that became a hub of the community. Formal education was a luxury in the Cookson Hills, where survival often took precedence over schooling. For the Floyd children, graduating from the 6th grade was considered a solid education. Beyond that point, the classroom was replaced by the fields, and boys like Charlie learned life's harder lessons through work. For many families, this hands-on apprenticeship on the farm was seen as a far more practical preparation for adulthood than the reading and writing of traditional schooling. Charlie embraced this rugged education, mastering the art of earning a living the only way he knew, through relentless effort, resourcefulness, and grit. Charlie Floyd was well regarded in his small community. Neighbours and townsfolk alike had a soft spot for the young man they affectionately nicknamed Choc, a playful nod to his early appreciation for Choctaw beer, which was a local favourite. When he wasn't helping out on his parents' farm, Charlie could often be found lounging on the walkway outside the family's general store, surrounded by friends who shared his sense of youthful curiosity. These boys, rough-edged but brimming with imagination, were the Cookson Hills' own version of Huckleberry Finn, dreaming of adventures that lay beyond the rugged ridges of their mountain home. Inspired by geography lessons about the wider world and local lore about notorious criminals, the boys eagerly devoured tales of Jesse James, the Younger Brothers, and the Cole Gang, all of whom had once used the Cookson Hills as their refuge. They were captivated by stories of hidden caves, whispered to have safeguarded stolen loot from bank heists, and the tantalizing rumors of buried treasure. For young Charlie, these stories weren't just entertainment, they were seeds of a dream, a vision of a life beyond the hard labor of tenant farming. One outlaw in particular captured Charlie's imagination: Henry Starr, a legendary desperado who had terrorized the region just a generation earlier. Starr's exploits were the stuff of folk heroism. His criminal career spanned over 30 years, where he started off as just a petty horse thief and evolved into one of America's most notorious bank and train robbers. Despite his many crimes, Starr always evaded the hangman's noose, earning pardons from figures as prominent as President Theodore Roosevelt and benefiting from legal dismissals and narrow escapes. His reputation of a gentleman outlaw, one who wouldn't harm women or working men, cemented his status as a folk hero amongst the local populace. Historian Michael Wallace described him as the classic social bandit, at least in the minds of the public. In the quiet moments of twilight, Charlie would sit on the stoop of the Floyd family home, listening to the melodic calls of thrushes from the trees overhead. His thoughts would drift far from the Cookson Hills, imagining himself astride a saddle, a six-shooter in hand, riding off into the horizon toward a life of adventure and destiny. It was Henry Starr's audacity and style that Charlie would later emulate, crafting his own outlaw persona and adopting a similar modus operandi. For Charlie, those twilight dreams planted the seeds of a life that would eventually make him infamous. A life of daring escapades, criminal notoriety, and the complex legacy of Pretty Boy Floyd. Chock had always been a well-behaved young man, rarely causing trouble. The closest he came to mischief was the time that he stole a box of cookies from J.H. Harkrider's grocery store in Sallisaw. When he was caught devouring the cookies behind the store, Chock quickly confessed. His father, Walter, disciplined him with a belt, and his mother tried her own way using the Bible and trying to instill the fear of God into her son, who was quickly going off the rails. However, young Charlie had no fear. Aged 15 in 1919, he left home to join a paid work crew harvesting fields in Kansas and Oklahoma. On the surface, it seemed like a good opportunity for a teenager like Chock to learn the value of hard work and gain practical skills. But the crews he worked with were often filled with drifters, men who moved from place to place, earning a living between bouts of carousing. Some were running from the law, and it was from these vagabonds that Chock began to hear tales of a different kind of life, one of easy money, debauchery, and getting by without putting in the hard work. To a young boy eager to break free from the confines of farm life, these men seemed to hold the keys to the world's secrets. They taught him how to fight, how to win without mercy, and how to play the game of life in a way that had little regard for the law. As Chock's older sister Rossi later put it, "That's when my brother met the wrong kind of men. They changed his way of thinking and doing." Upon returning to the Cookson Hills after the harvest, Chock's once familiar routine of fishing and mild leisure was replaced with long hours spent loafing in the billiard halls and music spots in Sallisaw. The mild-mannered boy who once avoided fights was now the one initiating them. His transition into a life of petty crime began with a small robbery. On a warm May evening in 1922, Chock and his friend Harold Franks broke into the Aikens post office, making off with a mere $3.50 in dimes, the only money that they could find. Although the take was small, even back in those days, robbing a federal facility was no minor crime. And when Chock was finally arrested, he narrowly avoided punishment. The case against him fell apart when key witnesses, which were neighbours of the Floyds, failed to show up in court, likely feeling sympathy for the young boy. After all, as many saw it in Sallisaw, every boy had to sow his wild oats. Chock seemed to straighten up after the close call. He worked a variety of jobs, first on a farm in Muskogee, and then in the oil fields, and later on a cotton plantation. The work was grueling, but the pay was better than what he had earned before. In the evenings, he relaxed by attending pie suppers, social dances, or playing baseball with his friends. He quickly became popular amongst the young women in the area, drawn to his sturdy frame, dark wavy hair, glinting eyes, dimples, and playful charm. He enjoyed their attention and, with a wink and a grin, he played the part of the charming young man to perfection. In many ways, Chock was more intelligent than most of the other young men in Aikens and Sallisaw. His demeanour was more assertive, and his speech at times had a refined quality that set him apart. He didn't just follow the crowd, he had bigger dreams. Chock was often vocal about his desire to leave the hills behind and explore the world beyond, and he often spoke of his ambition to seek out something more than the life of a small-town farm boy. His vision of a future filled with adventure and opportunity made him even more intriguing to those around him, particularly the young women who saw in him not just a local charmer, but a man destined for something bigger. However, it wasn't yet time for Chock to leave the Cookson Hills behind. In early 1924, a young girl from nearby Bixby, Ruby Hargraves, captured his heart. She fell in love with the square-jawed, handsome man that everybody in town called Chock. By June, they were married. Ruby was 16 and Chock was 20. Part Cherokee, she was tall, slender, and strikingly beautiful, with dark features that complemented her husband's fair looks. They bought a modest two-room house in Aikens, and in December, their first son was born. Chock had hoped to name the boy Jack Dempsey Floyd after the famous heavyweight boxer, but Ruby, who wasn't as much of a sports fan, compromised with Charles Dempsey Floyd. Chock didn't argue, however, and his son always went by his middle name of Dempsey. During these months, Chock worked on local cotton farms, harvesting the grueling crop known as Old King cotton in the South. Cotton led the farming industry in Oklahoma and created thousands of jobs. The work was backbreaking, with long 12-hour days spent pulling cotton from the thorny pods and filling heavy sacks. Workers, often parched with thirst, would be lucky to get a break to drink water or wring out sweat-drenched bandanas. By day's end, the cotton burrs would have torn through even the toughest work gloves, leaving workers with raw, bloody hands. Chock yearned for something more than the back-breaking life of a cotton picker. He remembered the lessons he had learnt from the men he had met on the harvest crew, those who had shown him a way out, a path that didn't involve endless labour. During the harvest, he crossed paths with 19-year-old John Hildebrand, a young thief with a taste for danger. He boasted to Chock about his recent robbery of a St. Louis electrical store, where he made off with about $1,900. Hildebrand proposed to Chock that they form a partnership and that with Chock's help, they could pull off more robberies and make enough money to change their lives. "I know the joint's ripe for the picking," Hildebrand told him. "You could send your wife and kid back more dough than you could ever imagine." Floyd was trying to make an honest living, but he couldn't control the itch to make more of himself. In August 1925, Chock kissed Ruby and their son goodbye, promising to return soon. He headed for St. Louis, the Mecca on the Mississippi, with Hildebrand. They wasted no time, and by the end of the month, they had hit half a dozen food stores and service stations, netting about $565 in total. Though the take was modest, the thrill of the crimes was like nothing Chock had ever experienced, and he quickly grew addicted to the rush. It was, just as the men on the harvest crew had promised, so easy. In early September, Hildebrand received a tip from a friend, Joe Hlavatry, a small-time hoodlum, who warned them of a large payroll delivery expected at the Kroger grocery store in St. Louis on September the 11th. In exchange for the tip-off, Hlavatry asked to be included in the heist, and Hildebrand agreed. On the day of the robbery, Chock, Hildebrand and Helvatry stole a Cadillac and parked it in an alley across from the Kroger building. They waited, and by 1 p.m. an armoured vehicle pulled up to the dock, unloading satchels of money. The trio waited until the money was stacked on a cart, then entered the building, guns drawn. "Hands up," Hildebrand yelled. "All we want is the money." The men grabbed the cash and disappeared. The heist was a quick professional robbery, netting $11,500 in payroll cash. However, the thieves' naivety soon caught up with them. A few days later, they bought a new Studebaker and drove around Fort Smith, Arkansas, showing off their spoils. Suspicious police detained them, and during questioning, Hildebrand was recognized as a wanted criminal. Under interrogation, Hildebrand and Helvatry confessed to the Kroger robbery and implicated Chock. At their trial in November, a jury found all three men guilty of the robbery. Chock and Helvatry were sentenced to 5 years in prison, whilst Hildebrand, convicted of additional crimes, received 8 years. One memorable moment came when the payroll master described the robbers to the police, referring to Chock as a mere boy, a pretty boy with apple cheeks. This description became the perfect lead for journalists who, when Chock's name was finally revealed, began to use the moniker Pretty Boy Floyd. Whilst Chock despised the nickname, finding it effeminate, it stuck, forever linking him to a legacy that would follow him for the rest of his life. Pretty Boy was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary just before Christmas in 1925. Established in 1836, the penitentiary had grown over the decades to cover nearly 47 acres, which earned it the grim nickname of the bloodiest 47 acres in America. The prison was severely overcrowded, housing around 3,000 inmates. From his cramped cell, shared with 7 other prisoners, Chock could see the city of Jefferson below, nestled against the bluff on which the prison sat. The air was filled with the echoes of screams at night, a constant reminder of the violence that permeated the place. Rehabilitation was almost non-existent. Floyd quickly learned that survival meant staying under the radar and avoiding trouble. Early on, he heard of other inmates who were found beaten, strangled or knifed by cellmates for interfering in matters that weren't their concern. The guards, too, could be brutal, exacting punishment at the slightest provocation. Pretty Boy's focus was simple: do his time and get out as soon as possible. For a time, Floyd worked in the prison kitchen as a cook, then moved on to a job as a machine operator in the prison factory where inmates produced their own shoes and clothing. He also worked as an assistant to the plumbers. The workdays were long, often stretching 12 hours, and the atmosphere was one of tense silence, broken only by the necessary exchanges of instruction. A single misstep could lead to a blow from a billy club or a stint in solitary confinement. The jail was a hellhole, and it was an unbelievably long time. Towards the end of his sentence, the corrupt guards began demanding money, and if you couldn't pay up, you'd be beaten within an inch of your life. Chock was careful about whom he associated with, learning quickly whom to trust. He watched and listened, assessing the other inmates and guards, and sorting them into categories of who could be relied upon and who couldn't. One person he chose to befriend was Alfred "Red" Lovett, a bank robber with a reputation. Red was a quiet, observant man, a good listener, and had a network of connections, particularly in the booming city of Kansas City. Knowing he would be released first, Red invited Chock to reach out to him once he was out of prison. "You'll be an ex-con," Red told him. "You're not going to find any decent job in a decent world. All you've got is your own kind." Chock hesitated. The pull to return to Ruby and his son, Dempsey, was strong, but just 2 months before his release, he learned that Ruby had filed for divorce, citing neglect. A prison attorney informed him that he had the option to contest the divorce, but Chock, knowing deep down that he wasn't yet ready to live a straight life, chose not to fight it. When he finally walked out of the Missouri State Penitentiary on March the 7th, 1929, he had just put an end to the worst 3.5 years of his life. He made a promise to himself that he'd never serve time in prison again and would never be taken alive. And it was a promise that he kept. Prison had failed Floyd, and after his release, he didn't head back home. Instead, he made a direct path for Kansas City, eager to start out in the most corrupt city imaginable. When Chalk stepped off the train at Kansas City's Union Railway Station, he was eager to see what the city had to offer. It didn't take long for him to get his answer. He discovered that Kansas City, Missouri, was an irreverent, bustling town, a modern-day Wild West, as columnist Manly O. Hudson had described it in 1923. A place still alive with a frontier spirit, but now outfitted with all the trappings of the modern era. Lovett met him at the station, ready to show him the ropes. He introduced Chalk to all the right men in the right places, shadowy little dive bars where criminals with all sorts of reputations struck deals and hung out. Bank robbers, conmen, thieves, smugglers and safecrackers, all either on the run or gearing up for their next big score. As Lovett took him from one hideout to another, Floyd couldn't help but notice that the darker the den, the sharper the instincts of its inhabitants. These were no amateurs, only the best survived here, and Chalk, feeling a growing sense of belonging, was finally content. Big money flowed in Kansas City, and it was all thanks to Thomas J. Prendergast, the head of the corrupt Democratic machine. Prendergast kept the city as loose and lawless as he could, always with his eye on the prize. Having made a fortune in the beer business, he was now raking in even more cash by profiting from the black market during Prohibition. Prendergast had made himself a kingpin, a Catholic benefactor of the city who, by the time Floyd arrived, owned much of the town. Beneath him was a network of crooked magistrates, attorneys, police officers, aldermen and businessmen, all quick to do his bidding. John Lazia, a mafia-backed enforcer from Kansas City's Little Italy, was Prendergast's right-hand man, ensuring that the town ran exactly as Tom wanted. Though Lovett was not part of the organised crime syndicate, he knew how to navigate its world. He preferred to remain independent, out of the reach of puppet masters. He taught Floyd how to stay in the shadows, listening for opportunities and speaking only when necessary. He told Chalk to keep his head down, to rub elbows with the professionals, and to avoid the loudmouths and slackers. To make his mark quietly but effectively, and to always be prepared to succeed. Kansas City was a place where a man like Pretty Boy, sharp-witted with a sense of diplomacy and a gun, could rise quickly through the ranks. Lovett brought Floyd from dive to dive, each more thrilling than the last, all under the glaring neon lights that illuminated the city's nightlife. For Chalk, the thrill wasn't just in the partying, it was in learning the ropes of big-time crime. By 1929, Kansas City had become a crown jewel in the chain of lawless havens stretching from St. Paul and Detroit in the north to Joplin, Missouri and Hot Springs, Arkansas in the south. Criminals, their faces plastered on wanted posters, bought protection from the police and moved through the city without fear of interference. They frequented the city's 24-hour gambling houses where the options for vice were endless. The Cuban Gardens, the Renault Club, the Yellow Front Saloon and the Spinning Wheel were just a few of the notorious spots where customers would get drunk and strike deals. At the Chesterfield Club, business was conducted in the haze of cigarette smoke and the clinking of glasses, while cocktail waitresses in barely their outfits served drinks with a smile. The sounds of jazz from Charlie Parker, Count Basie and Benny Moten filled the air, drawing people from all over to experience the sinful delights of Kansas City. As an ex-con, the police followed him relentlessly, day and night, which became a constant irritation and a significant hindrance to his ability to succeed in Kansas City. The places where he might find work were also the places where, if he was seen lingering too long, he would risk violating his probation.
Lovett did what he could to help, pulling a few strings to secure Chock a room at Mother Ash's boarding house on Home Street.
The house, run by Sadie Ash, a former Sunday school teacher gone astray, served as a cooling-off spot for criminals.
Sadie's two sons, William and Wallace, were involved in the drug trade, and Chock, now without a wife, found himself drawn to Wallace's discontented and flirtatious wife, Beulah Baird.
What began as an affair behind Wallace's back quickly escalated, and when Wallace found out, Beulah, preferring the name Juanita, left her husband, moved in with Chock, and continued the relationship in a small apartment nearby. However, without protection from the Ash brothers, Floyd found the police more persistent than ever. The couple moved frequently, changing aliases as often as a head waiter changes aprons, but nothing seemed to work. It was suspected that Wallace Ash, filled with jealousy, was paying off the police to harass Chock. Throughout the summer of 1929, he was questioned by the police in connection with 4 alleged hold-ups, but they could never gather enough evidence to detain him. Chock had only returned to the Cookson Hills once since his release, a brief visit to see his family and son, whom he missed dearly. In November 1929, he returned to the hills again, this time for the funeral of his father. Walter Floyd had been killed in a quarrel with neighbour Jim Mills over a pile of lumber. After the funeral, Jim Mills mysteriously disappeared, but local police made little effort to investigate, opting instead to bid Floyd farewell when he left again for Kansas City, wishing him the best in his future endeavours. Jim Mills is thought to be the first person that Pretty Boy Floyd killed. Chock's stay in Kansas City this time was brief, just long enough to tie up loose ends with the Jim Bradley gang. Bradley, who had known Pretty Boy from their time together at the Missouri State Pen, had reconnected with him in Kansas City, now assembling an Ohio-based criminal operation. He liked Floyd, impressed by his common sense and cool demeanour. In January 1930, Chock kissed Juanita goodbye and joined Bradley and his crew, experienced bank robber Nathan King and elusive shoplifter Nellie Maxwell. The gang's initial forays were semi-successful, netting them some cash from several bank heists. However, the results were generally disappointing. The most lucrative score came on February the 5th, 1930, at the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Sylvania, Ohio, where they made $2,000.
For 3 months, the gang evaded roadblocks and car chases across the flat Ohio countryside. But on March the 8th, their luck ran out in Akron when 2 police officers spotted 2 men resembling Bradley and King and approached them for questioning. The outlaws tried to flee, but they crashed into another car. King surrendered immediately, but Bradley opened fire, shooting police officer Harland Maines in the stomach, who sadly died of his wounds. Bradley made a run for it and did manage to escape, although he was quite badly wounded in the process.
Whether King cooperated with the authorities is unclear, but by that afternoon, Akron detectives raided the gang's hideout and found Maxwell and Floyd tending to the wounded Bradley. The 3 criminals were caught by surprise. The hideout was clearly ready for a quick departure. Police found bags packed, a machine gun with a 150 bullet clip wrapped in a blanket, 3 sets of license plates for Ohio, Indiana and Michigan, expensive luggage, nitroglycerine and rubber gloves. Outside, a stolen car sat with holes in its back window to accommodate the muzzle of a machine gun. In the aftermath, Bradley was sentenced to death for the murder of Officer Maines, while Chock Floyd and Nathan King received maximum sentences of 15 years for their robberies across Ohio. When Bradley was executed in November 1930, he muttered, "If you think I'm tough, boys, wait until you get a load of that Floyd." Though the law may have scoffed at Bradley's words, it was about to realise just how prophetic they were. On a train on the way to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus, Chock managed to convince his guards to uncuff him so that he could use the bathroom. One armed guard followed him, waiting outside, but within seconds of Floyd entering the stall, there was a sound of breaking glass. The guards rushed in to find an open window and saw Floyd's silhouette disappearing into the night. By the time the train stopped and the police surrounded the area, Chock had vanished into the black void of the Ohio countryside. All they found was a footprint on the glass he had broken. Floyd returned to Kansas City, his only refuge left. He knew heading straight back to the Cookson Hills would be a grave mistake. The headlines screamed, "Pretty Boy Floyd escapes train to prison," and although Chock despised the nickname, he couldn't deny the thrill that it brought. In some twisted way, he felt like a hero, a man on the run with a story to tell. But Chock knew that his time in Kansas City couldn't last. After reconnecting with Juanita, who was delighted to read about his daring escape, Floyd tracked down a fellow mobster on the run, a gunman named William Miller.
When Chock found him, Miller was ecstatic, and the two began planning a series of bank jobs across the East and the South. However, before they left Kansas City, there was one little last matter to deal with. The Ash brothers, William and Wallace, were stirring trouble again. William's wife, Rose, sister to Juanita Baird, had left him and was staying with Chock and Juanita. The Ash brothers, seething with anger, had tipped off the police about Chock's return, betraying the unwritten comrade code of the Kansas City underworld. Worse still, they were making their rounds at the local hangouts, threatening that Chock would either die or be captured. They publicly mocked him in the shadowy bars of Kansas City, imitating his pretty boy moniker in a mocking and contemptuous manner which only angered Chock.
Before Chock and Miller left town, the Ash brothers were found dead in a ditch on the outskirts of Kansas City. The police knew who was behind the killings, but by the time they arrived, Chock, Miller, Juanita and her sister Rose were long gone. The partnership between Chock and Miller was never meant to last. After making off with $2,000 from the Mount Zion Bank in the small town of Ellison, Kentucky, and another $1,000 from the White House Bank in Ohio, the law was closing in. In Bowling Green, Ohio, while shopping at Ullman's clothing store, a salesperson recognized Chock from the wanted posters and quickly alerted authorities. Two policemen arrived at the scene, waiting outside as the group emerged. When Chock and Miller stepped out, the police commanded them to surrender. Instead, the two outlaws drew their revolvers, sparking a fierce shootout in the busy streets of Bowling Green. As citizens ducked for cover, the gunfire rang out, with Chock and Miller maneuvering down the sidewalk, trying to make it to their car. Billy the Killer Miller took a fatal shot in the chest and collapsed instantly, dying aged just 25.
Juanita, too, was struck by a ricochet bullet that entered the back of her head and caused her to collapse to the ground. Seeing this, her sister Rose screamed and threw herself over her sister. Now alone, Chock dashed between parked cars, edging closer to their getaway vehicle. When Officer Kastner moved in to try and get a clearer shot, Chock opened fire, striking the policeman in his abdomen. When his partner returned fire, his shots missed. With bullets pinging off the car, Chock quickly jumped behind the wheel and sped off, taking the car through the streets of Bowling Green in a reckless escape, heading in any direction, trying to put as much distance between himself and the law as possible.
By the time he reached safety, Chock swore that he'd never return to Ohio. The state had only brought him bad luck. One of the police officers that Floyd had hit with his pistol, Officer Ralph Kastner, died a week after the shooting. Juanita, after being shot in the cheek, made a full recovery and returned to Kansas City. William the Killer Miller was buried a week later, and the authorities were desperate for Pretty Boy Floyd to follow a similar fate. By April 1931, Chock was heading west towards the Cookson Hills, hotter than ever. After weeks hiding in the thick brush near Aikens, Oklahoma, he visited his widowed mother and siblings before heading back into the mountains, armed and more determined than ever to make this his home base. Here, in the land he knew best, Floyd felt secure. The people around him had his back. No informants, no power-hungry men out for payback, no Ash brothers to stir trouble. The state cops and the newly formed Oklahoma Bureau of Criminal Investigation were no match for him. They didn't know the hills, the back roads or the forests like he did. Chock was a part of this land. Every trail, every cave, every leaf was familiar to him. Since Chock's last visit, the Great Depression had gripped the country and Ohio was hit the hardest out of anywhere in America. Wall Street's collapse had sent the nation into a downward spiral, with the effects hitting rural America hard. Farmers were the first to feel the effects. The prices of farm produce plummeted, while the cost of farming equipment skyrocketed. Croppers lost their homes to merciless bankers, and small-town economies crumbled, leaving entire communities bankrupt. When Pretty Boy Floyd returned to Oklahoma, he wasn't just returning back to his old life, he had a new purpose. No longer did he rob banks out of restlessness or the thrill of it all, now he had a cause. He wasn't just taking money for the sake of it, he was sending a message to the wealthy, the bankers, and the people who hoarded wealth while the poor suffered. He had grown tired of the surface level excitement and now the fight was personal. His message was clear. If the government wasn't going to help the common man, then Pretty Boy Floyd would. It was in this new phase of life that Floyd's legend truly began to soar, gaining traction in a way that felt inevitable. The sound of his Thompson submachine gun firing through the valleys of Oklahoma, Arkansas and Missouri was more than just the sound of gunfire. It was the beat of a drum heralding his crusade. By the end of 1931, Floyd had pulled off enough bank robberies, disrupted enough crooked business deals, and handed out enough stolen cash to the poor to earn the adoration of the public. During his many bank robberies of 1931, he often instructed the bank manager to show him not just where the cash was, but also the mortgage papers, which he would also steal and destroy, freeing hundreds of Oklahoma residents from property debt. He earned the title of the Robin Hood of Oklahoma, with most seeing him as a hero for the downtrodden. Many Ohio residents thought the banks were on the wrong side of the law themselves, so of course they worshipped Floyd. To the working class farmer, Chock couldn't be more honest. To help carry out his mission, Chock needed an assistant. Someone who he could trust to help with the robberies and act as a lookout. He turned to George Birdwell, an old friend from his youth in the hills. Birdwell, now in his mid-40s, had traded his Bible for a gun. Between 1931 and 1932, Floyd and Birdwell would go on to rob more banks than any other criminals in Oklahoma's history. The list of their targets read like a directory of local banks. Conower Bank, the Bank of Shamrock, Morris State Bank in Muskogee, the State Bank of Castle, the Bank of Paden, Dover Bank in Oklahoma City, and many others in every direction. Nobody knows for sure quite how many banks Pretty Boy Floyd robbed in his lifetime, maybe 50, 60, perhaps even more. They were all mostly country banks off the beaten track that didn't have a lot of money in them, but that also meant that they didn't have a lot of security, making them easy pickings. Quite like his Western heroes, Billy the Kid or Jesse James, when they gained notoriety, every single robbery in the Wild West was now attributed to them. And similarly, every single bank robbed in the West in the first half of the 1930s was now attributed to Pretty Boy Floyd. It was easier for a bank manager to say that their bank had been robbed by an absolute professional like Pretty Boy Floyd than admitting that some of the robberies might have been conducted by a couple of no-name criminals who didn't really know what they were doing. It was far better from the bank manager's point of view to say they'd been robbed by the notorious Pretty Boy Floyd. Each robbery followed a meticulous plan. Birdwell would first case the joint, sizing up the bank's defences. He'd assess the number of guards, determine the bank's layout, figure out where the safes were and how accessible they were, check the alarm system to see if it was on the new buzzer type or the old clanging style chain, and assess the bank's traffic, avoiding the busiest hours to minimise risk. Once everything was in place, the two bandits would park the getaway car close, keeping the engine running. The Ford V8 was their vehicle of choice for its speed and roominess. Wearing their hats low over their eyes, they would enter the bank, guns drawn. Birdwell would direct his machine gun at the guards, whilst Chalk would cover the employees, ensuring a smooth and efficient heist. Pretty Boy Floyd had a distinctive way of carrying his Thompson submachine gun. He preferred to carry Thompsons with the buttstock removed and a 20-round clip instead of the usual drum magazine. This setup made the weapon more compact, allowing it to be concealed beneath an overcoat. In a shootout, Floyd could fire one-handed, leaving his other hand free to carry loot, seize hostages, or steer the getaway car. Whilst Birdwell kept guards occupied, Chalk would leap over the counter, grab a teller, and use them as leverage. He'd hold the hostage until the tellers complied and gathered the cash he demanded. If an alarm had been triggered, Floyd and Birdwell would exit the bank calmly, still holding a hostage as a shield. Once in the getaway car, they might even make the hostage climb in with them to deter pursuit, before eventually dropping them off at the edge of town. By early 1932, bank insurance premiums had doubled due to the escalating wave of Floyd's robberies. The outraged bankers pressured Governor Bill Money to deploy the National Guard in pursuit of the elusive criminal. His response was candid and resonated with a touch of humour. National Guard, as long as he stays down there where he's at and is protected the way he is by those people, he will continue to rob banks, National Guard or not. The governor's words highlighted something crucial. Floyd's reputation as a folk hero had spread far and wide, especially amongst the impoverished of Oklahoma. His actions, whether robbing from the banks or helping the less fortunate, painted him as a Robin Hood figure. He brought money and groceries to families that weren't going to have a Christmas. These were families who didn't have anything at all. Floyd's generosity knew no bounds. He was generous to kids and old people, and it was reported that at one point he was feeding over 24 families. Stories of Floyd's kindness were passed from person to person, growing into a legend that stretched across the country, making Pretty Boy Floyd a symbol of defiance against the wealthy and a hero to the common folk, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Floyd's popularity reached such heights that when he decided to rob the bank in his hometown of Sallisaw, he gave everyone the heads up. Family, friends, neighbours and even casual passers-by gathered around, some sitting on the sidewalk under the shade of the boardwalk as if attending a public spectacle. The bank president thought Floyd was just playing a joke until Floyd's car appeared outside, greeted by cheers from the crowd who were chanting, "Give 'em hell, Chalk." With a smile, Floyd entered the bank and, addressing the surprised president, quit, "No offence, but hell, I'm sure you wouldn't mind making a little contribution to the community." Despite his local fame and the public's amusement, law enforcement wasn't entertained by Floyd's antics. In response to his increasingly bold robberies, the Oklahoma Bankers Association convened a meeting and a reward of $5,000 was offered for Floyd's capture, dead or alive. The Oklahoma Bureau of Criminal Investigation led the charge, sending county sheriffs after Floyd, but their efforts were in vain. They chased him from town to town, fully prepared for a shootout, but failed to catch him. The growing absurdity of the manhunt became a source of local amusement, with the authorities appearing more like bumbling fools than effective law enforcement. Floyd wasn't one to rest on his laurels or depend on his reputation for too long. In an effort to ease the pressure on himself and Birdwell, he decided to lay low for a while. The thrill of being on the run had worn thin, and he found himself missing Ruby and his young son, Dempsey. In late 1931, Chalk decided it was time to reconnect with his family. He discovered that Ruby had remarried to a man in Coffeyville, Kansas. But when Chalk showed up on her doorstep, the spark between them reignited instantly. Ruby, still in love with him, left an apologetic note for a new husband, and, without hesitation, took little Dempsey Floyd, dressed in his Sunday best, and left with Pretty Boy.
The reunited Floyds made their way to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where they rented a modest home under the alias of Mr. and Mrs. Jack Hamilton. Birdwell, not far behind with his wife and 4 children, adopted his own pseudonym and settled in a nearby house. For the first time in years, Chock felt a fleeting sense of normality between September 1931 and February 1932. Dempsey went to school, and Chock and Birdwell occasionally robbed banks in more remote areas when their funds ran low. To the neighbours, Floyd was simply a travelling salesman from Kansas City, which explained his frequent disappearances.
It was a period of happiness for the Floyds, one that Dempsey would later reflect on fondly. In an episode of Biography aired in 1995, he shared,
"It was the best 6 months of my life that I can remember being with him. He did a lot of funny things. He teased my mother, and he cooked for us. He made spaghetti and meatballs, and he enjoyed cooking and doing things with us. Took me fishing and did everything that fathers usually do, wrestle around with me. And at night, he'd always take me to bed. He'd put me on his shoulders and take me in and throw me into bed, like having fun with me. My mother and father, when I saw them together, they were, it was just great. They were in love. You could tell they were. And I used to go in before they get up. Kids usually get up before their parents. And I'd go ahead and look at them, and, excuse me, he'd always have his arm kind of around her. And it thrilled me to see them that way.
After several months in Fort Smith, Ruby expressed dissatisfaction with the local schools, mentioning that she had heard from neighbours that Dempsey could receive a better education in Tulsa. Chock, always eager to please, moved the family to a quiet part of Tulsa, settling near one of the city's better schools. In their new home at 513 East Young Street, Chock enjoyed a more family-oriented lifestyle. After school, he would often tumble and roughhouse with Dempsey and his friends in the backyard, or play t-ball with them on a vacant lot at the end of the street. However, it wasn't long before trouble began to brew. The residents of the block began to gossip. They whispered about the strange hours that Mr. Douglas kept, and about the odd-looking man, Birdwell, who would show up late at night to pick up Floyd. The car lights off and engine idling before they both disappeared for days. Neighbours noticed the curtains always drawn and how Douglas seemed friendly but would quickly turn away when anyone got too close to him. Eventually, they began to suspect that Douglas bore a striking resemblance to the fugitive on the wanted poster down at the courthouse, none other than Pretty Boy Floyd. Chock could feel the walls closing in. One Sunday, whilst attending services at Shawnee Baptist Church with Ruby and Dempsey, a church member pulled him aside and asked him outright, "Are you Pretty Boy?" After a moment's hesitation, Chock responded, "Yes, I am. Next time you talk to the minister, please give him my regards and tell him I want to be saved." The confession didn't seem to faze him, but it foreshadowed what was to come. In early February 1932, the authorities received a tip from a neighbour. They began to surveil the Douglas residence, and when George Birdwell arrived at the house one morning, the police were convinced that the real occupant was none other than Pretty Boy Floyd.
On February the 11th, a squad of officers surrounded the house and an armoured vehicle rumbled across the yard. Tear gas was thrown through the front and back windows and the officers waited. When no one emerged, they donned gas masks and broke through the front door. Chock, Ruby, Birdwell and little Dempsey had escaped just moments earlier. The family had split up, Ruby and Dempsey heading on foot for the bus station, whilst Chock and Birdwell took the motor and headed for the safety of the Cookson Hills. This wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last, that Chock would escape from law enforcement. In fact, he was pretty good at it.
Ruby and Dempsey were apprehended that afternoon, and their home was turned upside down in search of clues to Chalk's whereabouts. Ruby insisted that she hadn't seen or heard from Chalk in months, but when little Dempsey saw his father's mugshot on the desk at the police station, he innocently pointed at it and said, "That's my daddy. Him and Mr. Birdwell were at my house this morning." Ruby was interrogated, but by morning, with no concrete evidence, the police released her, though they knew it was only a matter of time before Floyd would resurface. All efforts to capture the elusive fugitive had come to nothing, so Oklahoma officials turned to a recently retired sheriff with a formidable reputation, Irv Kelley. Known for his relentless pursuit of criminals, Kelley had brought more bank robbers to justice than any other sheriff in Oklahoma's history during the ages of the Wild West. With a remarkable ability to pick up a trail where others faltered, Kelley was the perfect man for the job. The politicians in Oklahoma urgently asked him to return to duty, if only for the task of capturing Pretty Boy Floyd. Kelley agreed to the challenge. His first move was to set up surveillance on the home where Ruby and Dempsey Floyd were living, confident that Pretty Boy would eventually return there or that they would leave to meet him. On April the 3rd, 1932, it seemed that Kelley's hunch would finally pay off. Ruby and Dempsey left their home early that morning, and the lawmen followed them to Bixby, where Ruby parked at the Cecil Bennett farm. She and Dempsey then crossed the road to a brown 2-story house that belonged to Ruby's father, Mr. Hargraves. The house, set back behind a sturdy fence and gate, was the perfect setting for a rendezvous. Kelley and his team watched as the elderly Hargraves greeted his daughter and grandson, inviting them into the house with a warm smile. It seemed likely that Chalk Floyd would show up soon. Without hesitation, Kelley called for reinforcements. That night, the posse assembled in town before heading out in the dark towards the Hargraves farm.
The posse's plan was carefully orchestrated, with 4 machine gunners placed at the side of the road leading to the gate and Kelley acting as a roadblock. Around 2 a.m, the team began to suspect that Chalk would not show up that night. There were no lights on at the Hargraves farm, suggesting that no one was expected that night. With the air growing chill, the team asked Kelley if they could head into town for some coffee, and Kelley, ever the patient hunter, told them, "You boys go ahead, never mind me. I'll stay here just a bit more, just in case." And, as luck would have it, fate intervened.
No sooner had the others left for town that Kelley heard the faint sound of an approaching car. As he peered into the darkness, he saw the outline of a dark vehicle creeping down the road, its hood shaped like a turtle's shell. The car slowed at the gate, its tyres crunching on the gravel. Kelley crouched behind a fence post, his machine gun ready, watching the vehicle intently. The car parked a few feet inside the gate, and 2 men emerged. Neither spoke a word. From the way they moved, Kelley could tell that they were as cautious and as alert as he was. Their gangland instincts, something Kelley knew all too well, told him that they were scanning the surroundings, preparing for whatever might lie ahead. In a few moments, they would be heading up the stairs and into the house. The time to act was now. "Throw up your hands, Floyd," Kelley commanded, steeping from his cover into the tense night, but he was not ready for the speed of Chalk Floyd's reflexes. By the time Kelley had finished his sentence, Floyd had already begun firing. The crack of his automatic echoed into the night, and before Kelley could react, the outlaw had emptied his .45 into the sheriff, hitting him 7 times. The force of the gunfire sent Kelley to the ground, but Floyd, in his panic, didn't immediately realise that he'd also been hit. He had taken shots in both legs and, tragically, in the scrotum, but his focus was on survival. Birdwell, uninjured, scrambled back into the car. The engine roared to life, and Chalk, using the last of his strength, reached for the open passenger door. He collapsed inside, barely able to communicate his instructions. "Go," he signalled to Birdwell. The tyres spun as the car shot forward, spraying dirt in all directions. By the time the rest of the team had arrived, Sheriff Kelley was already dead, and Floyd and Birdwell had disappeared into the darkness. Kelley had been a legendary figure in Oklahoma, a hero to many for his fearless pursuit of criminals. His encounters with the most dangerous men in the state were the stuff of legend. The news of his death devastated the public, and the state mourned the loss of the dedicated lawman who left behind a wife and 3 children. For the people of Oklahoma, the killing of Sheriff Kelley marked a dark chapter in Floyd's criminal career.
For Floyd, however, the killing was something that he'd never truly reconcile, although in his mind the encounter was a case of kill or be killed, and although he maintained that Kelley was foolish enough to attempt an ambush on him, the event weighed heavily on him. He talked about it when he gave a few interviews to a few newspaper reporters. He was disgusted with himself because Kelley left behind 3 children. The murder of Sheriff Kelley marked the first, and in fact it was the only murder on Floyd's record that he ever openly discussed, and this is because it haunted him until the day he died.
After his recovery, Chock Floyd retreated to the safety of the hills, staying briefly at his brother Bradley's home in Hillsborough. During this time, Juanita Baird re-entered the picture. She had also recovered from the wounds she sustained in Bowling Green, and alongside her sister Rose, managed to secure an appeal in Ohio that led to the dropping of the charges against them. With the legal troubles behind her, Juanita became Chock's constant companion once again. Ruby, ever the devoted wife, was not pleased by the reappearance of Juanita in Chock's life. However, when she heard that he had been injured in the confrontation with Sheriff Kelley, she put aside her anger and rushed to his side, staying with him for a few weeks. After Ruby left, it was Juanita's turn to hide out. The situation had started to wear on George Birdwell, who grew increasingly frustrated with Chock. He remarked to Pretty Boy Floyd that he might be better off focusing on business rather than chasing women. This comment sparked an argument, and the long-standing tension between the 2 men finally boiled over. Birdwell had become disillusioned with the growing myth of Pretty Boy Floyd, as he had been cast as little more than a sidekick to the more charismatic and famous Chock. The 2 parted ways, marking the end of their relationship. Birdwell's critique wasn't entirely off the mark. By this time, the legend of Floyd had taken on a new life of its own. News of his exploits were making headlines across the nation, especially as the country struggled through the Great Depression. To set the record straight, Chock gave an interview to the Daily Oklahoman, meeting a reporter called Vivian Brown, and offered a surprising reflection. I guess I've been accused of everything that has happened except the kidnapping of the Lindbergh child last spring. It ain't the names that they call me that makes me sore. I may be an alley rat or a skunk or even worse, but that don't give them a right to tell my kid that he can never amount to anything as long as he had a father like me. That kid can't help who his father is or what he does, but he does think the world of me, and I sure think he's all right too. For Chock Floyd, the image of being a father to his son Dempsey seemed to be the one thing that he held onto amidst his chaotic and violent life. Floyd learned that George Birdwell was killed during a hold-up along with a few other associates. Chock had warned Birdwell to avoid the town of Boley, Oklahoma, that he would stand out in the heavily black town, and that the local residents would most likely rush to the aid of the bank in the event of a robbery. His suspicions proved to be right, and George Birdwell was shot and killed by a citizen whilst trying to rob the Farmers and Merchants Bank, aged just 38 and leaving behind 4 children. Floyd expressed regret at the loss, acknowledging that, despite their differences, he had hoped that they could have reconciled. Birdwell's departure left a void, and Chock soon set out to find a replacement. He found a new partner in Adam Ricchetti, a 23-year-old machine gun expert and seasoned bandit. Floyd met Ricchetti toward the end of 1932, and they immediately got to work, hitting several banks in Oklahoma. They employed the same method of operation as before, with Aikens serving as their central hub and using back roads to avoid detection. The duo quickly gained notoriety for their daring bank robberies, with Pretty Boy Floyd's legend continuing to grow as a result of his ruthless efficiency and the growing mythos surrounding his exploits. As their criminal careers continued, the duo expanded their operations. Floyd, who was becoming increasingly famous and admired by the public, took to frequenting Missouri, a state he hadn't hit as much in the past.
It was during this time that Floyd had a deeply introspective moment on Mother's Day in 1933. Floyd met with his mother, attended church with her, and afterwards the two stopped to pay a visit to his father at his grave. He told his mother that his time was running out and he expected to be buried next to his parents. This conversation marked a pivotal moment in Floyd's life, as it was an admission that he felt cornered and signified a shift in his mindset. Perhaps for the first time, a realization that his own criminal lifestyle was leading him towards an inevitable, violent end.
The mention of his own death was significant, as it reflected Floyd's guilt over the death of Sheriff Kelley, an incident he could never fully shake off. After killing Kelley during the ambush in 1931, the image of the sheriff's children left behind weighed heavily on Floyd. He often wondered how his own son would cope with his eventual death, and this reflection seemed to deepen his sense of guilt. Despite the weight of these thoughts, Floyd was far from giving up on his criminal lifestyle. He and Ricchetti continued their spree, robbing banks in multiple states. Their escape from Bolivar, Missouri on June 8, 1933 represents one of the many close calls that the duo would endure, and this particular incident had a comical twist to it. The two outlaws had decided to switch vehicles, a tactic they regularly employed to avoid detection. They came across a 4-car garage owned by Excelsior High School in Cromwell, Oklahoma. Inside, they spotted a new Pontiac and figured it would make a good replacement for their current vehicle. However, whilst they were preparing to steal the car, a teacher locked the garage door from the outside. The duo, realising they'd been trapped, feared the police might have been alerted. With no time to waste, they decided to break out of the garage by smashing the Pontiac through the heavy door, leaving a dent in the car's fender. With the law likely on their tail, Floyd and Ricchetti quickly headed for Bolivar, Missouri to lay low for a bit and fix the car. Ricchetti's brother, Joe, worked as a mechanic at the Bitzer's garage at 115 West Broadway Street in the centre of town, and Floyd figured this would be the perfect place to repair the Pontiac and make sure it was in full working order before they took off again. Joe agreed to help, and Ernest Bitzer, the owner of the garage, was too intimidated by the Floyd gang to protest. However, trouble quickly brewed when Polk County Sheriff Jack Killingsworth and his deputy pulled into the gas station where the duo had stopped. Ricchetti, who had been drinking, panicked at the sight of the officers and loudly muttered, "Damn the law." This alerted the two lawmen to the criminal's presence. Floyd quickly drew his pistol before Killingsworth could react, taking the sheriff hostage. The deputy managed to flee the scene, running off to summon help. They sped off through the back roads, avoiding major highways where they could be spotted. The police, now aware of the situation, launched a massive search party of over 300 police officers, including city and county policemen and the highway patrol, joining the chase for the duo. As dusk settled, the outlaws managed to flag down an unsuspecting, innocent motorist on the outskirts of Deepwater. They eventually stole his car whilst keeping the sheriff captive. They drove into Kansas City, hoping to find a place to lay low. Once they were within the city, Floyd and Ricchetti stopped at the corner of 9th Street and Hickory. There, they released Sheriff Killingsworth, with Floyd warning him not to alert the authorities too quickly. "Now don't go rushing to the phone, copper. Give us time to get away," Floyd said as he and Ricchetti disappeared into the night. When Killingsworth eventually returned to his post, he gave reporters an unusual description of Floyd. Whilst he acknowledged Floyd's criminal career, he said, "Floyd seemed as clean a fellow as I ever ran into, outside his record." He further noted that Floyd had treated him with respect during the entire ordeal, which was something that surprised the sheriff. In fact, Floyd had confided into Killingsworth during their brief captivity, expressing a rare moment of vulnerability. Floyd spoke about the constant pressure he felt living a life on the run, hunted day and night. He shared his fears, noting, "Sooner or later, I'll go down full of lead. That's how it will end. How would you like to be hunted day and night? How would you like to sleep with this thing," pointing to his Thompson submachine gun, "across your knees?" Then Floyd fell silent. After a moment, he turned to the sheriff with a look that suggested a sense of regret, and he added, "I have a son, and I'd like to see him before I die." This vulnerability was a stark contrast to the image he projected as a ruthless bandit, adding layers to his character and motivations. The Kansas City Massacre of June 1933 marked a pivotal moment in Pretty Boy Floyd's life and ultimately sealed his fate. This violent and tragic event would haunt him until his own death. Although Floyd's name would be forever linked to the massacre, it appears that he had no direct involvement in it. Nevertheless, the massacre intensified the nationwide manhunt for Floyd, setting the stage for his eventual downfall. The events leading up to the massacre began on the morning of June the 17th, when Frank "Jelly" Nash, a notorious criminal, was being escorted by 4 police officers from the Union Railway Station in Kansas City to a car. Nash had escaped from the Leavenworth State Penitentiary in Kansas in 1930, and after helping 7 other inmates escape, he had been on the run for nearly 3 years. The day before, on June the 16th, Nash was finally recaptured in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and authorities were determined to transport him safely to jail. The group of officers, including FBI agents R.J. Caffrey and Reed Vitterli, as well as Kansas City police officers W.J. Grooms, Frank Hermanson, and Chief of Police Otto Reed, were tasked with escorting Nash. As they hurried him outside their Chevrolet sedan, the doors of the car were unlocked and Nash was placed in the front seat. Just as the officers were taking their places in the vehicle, they were ambushed.
Suddenly, 3 gunmen emerged from the parked car behind the sedan. A barrage of gunfire rang out, and officers Grooms and Hermanson were killed instantly. Agent Vitterli was wounded but managed to seek cover, and Agent Caffrey was fatally shot in the head, and Police Chief Otto Reed was killed. Nash, seated in the front seat, was also riddled with bullets and pronounced dead at the scene. Remarkably, Agent Reed Vitterli survived despite taking 3 gunshot wounds. The gunmen fled the scene, and the shooting spree left the city stunned. Remarkably, no innocent bystanders were slain, but the attack did leave 4 law enforcement officials and Frank Nash dead.
The country reacted with outrage. The killing of law enforcement officers and a federal agent, coupled with the brazen nature of the attack, shocked the nation. The memory of the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago resurfaced as the public feared that gang violence and lawlessness were spreading unchecked across the country. Attorney General Homer Cummings spoke for the government, condemning the killers and calling for a full investigation. He declared that the murder of a Department of Justice agent was a direct challenge to the government. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, quickly turned his attention to Floyd Ricchetti and a former World War I hero turned criminal, Vern Miller. Vern Miller had ties to the Kansas City underworld and worked as a hitman for mob boss John Lazier, and Hoover believed he had been involved in the massacre. The next day, Hoover's words rang out across the nation as he made a public statement over the radio. No time, money, or labour will be spared towards bringing about the individuals responsible for this cowardly, despicable act. They must be eliminated, and to this end, we are dedicating ourselves. Hoover's dedication to bringing the killers to justice marked the beginning of a relentless pursuit of Floyd and his associates. Though it's thought that Floyd had no direct role in the massacre, the FBI's swift targeting of him and his associates would become a defining feature of the government's crackdown on gangsters during the Prohibition era. The massacre became a death warrant for Floyd, with law enforcement across the country determined to hunt him down at all costs. Chalk's life was now under constant threat as the nation's most powerful law enforcement agencies vowed to end his reign of terror. The question of Pretty Boy Floyd's involvement in the Kansas City massacre is one that has been clouded with doubt and suspicion from the outset. The incident itself, as tragic as it was, seems to have been a case of bad luck for Floyd.
Most scholars and historians all agree that Pretty Boy Floyd was actually not involved in the Kansas City massacre at all. The event simply does not line up with his criminal style, and most believe that actually the perpetrators were mafia-hired gunmen sent on a mission to flee Frank Nash from custody. There is also a prevailing theory that the Kansas City massacre was not an attempt to flee Frank Nash, but an attempt to silence him. He had helped orchestrate many high-profile criminals escape from Leavenworth State Penitentiary. It is believed that those in the underworld feared his knowledge of their operations. The mission to extract Nash from police custody may have just gone horribly wrong, with either the FBI agents or the criminals involved being too quick to pull the trigger.
It's believed that the FBI's allegations against Floyd were not backed up by any evidence. The style of the attack simply did not match Floyd's typical modus operandi, and it's believed that the real culprits, those who had botched the job, were later killed by the mob for their failure. The car used by the shooters was found burned with an unidentified body inside, and Vern Miller was found dead in November of the same year. Despite the lack of evidence linking Floyd to the massacre, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, quickly turned to him as the prime suspect. Hoover's interest in the case went beyond solving the crime. It was an opportunity for him to further consolidate his power. As Hoover sought greater influence within the federal government, particularly during a period of political change with the Roosevelt administration, the Kansas City massacre provided a perfect opportunity to bolster the reputation of the FBI. Hoover's grieving over the loss of officers was genuine, but the crime also allowed him to enhance his position within the Bureau. Hoover found it easier to blame Floyd, a public figure with a significant reputation, rather than go after the powerful political figures and gangsters who ran the Kansas City underworld. By branding Floyd as public enemy number one, Hoover stood to gain substantial media attention and resources for the FBI, which ultimately helped to strengthen his control over the Bureau. Hoover owed much of his rise to prominence to the high-profile pursuit of Floyd. By making Floyd a symbol of lawlessness, Hoover could demonstrate the necessity of his growing law enforcement apparatus and secure more funding, agents, and public support to eventually establish the FBI. Floyd's notoriety provided Hoover with the perfect scapegoat, one that he could exploit to further his own career ambitions. The three separate witnesses who were shown fugitive cars after the Kansas City massacre each dismissed Pretty Boy Floyd's photograph, instead identifying other notorious criminals involved in the event. Vern Miller, Wilbur Underhill, and Harvey Bailey were all recognised as the actual perpetrators. Chalk maintained his innocence to his dying day, insisting that he had no part in the massacre. Floyd swore on his father's grave that he was not involved in the killing of the officers. To further cement his claim, he sent a postcard to the Kansas City police directly denying any involvement. The postcard read, "Dear Sirs, I, Charles Floyd, want it made known that I did not participate in the massacre of officers at Kansas City. Charles Floyd."
This gesture, a straightforward declaration of his innocence, could have had a great impact on the situation had it been given the attention it deserved. However, the media were far more focused on the sensational headlines that Pretty Boy Floyd and the criminal persona that Floyd had built over the years, as that ultimately sold more newspapers the following morning. His involvement in other crimes, such as the killing of Sheriff Irv Kelley, had never been denied, but he was absolutely adamant, as were the rest of his family, that he had absolutely nothing to do with the Kansas City massacre.
Floyd's son, Dempsey, later spoke on his father's behalf in an interview, reiterating that his father was not the type to take a paid contract to kill a lawman.
My father wasn't a hired killer. He robbed banks and he got all the money he needed from robbing banks. Why would he take a fee for killing some policemen that were trying to transfer another criminal? You know, I don't think he ever had anything to do with Nash. I never heard Nash's name mentioned in my life, except at the Kansas City Massacre.
This statement from Dempsey encapsulated the family's belief in Floyd's innocence with regard to the massacre. Despite the media's portrayal of Floyd as a violent criminal, those who knew him, especially his family, stood firm in their belief that he was not responsible for the bloodshed in Kansas City. In a desperate bid to escape the growing heat in the Midwest, Chock, along with Ricchetti and the Baird sisters, made their way east. They were hoping to find a refuge, a place to hide from the law. It's believed that they initially found a brief, albeit expensive, sanctuary in Cleveland, where they took shelter with the gang run by the flamboyant Jewish gangster Mo Davis. However, their stay in Cleveland was short-lived, as plainclothes officers began frequenting Davis's nightclubs, asking questions about Floyd's whereabouts. The bandits realised that the law was closing in on them. Davis's crew had been under surveillance and, soon enough, the heat in Ohio became too much. Chock had already faced trouble in the state twice before, and it was clear, 3 strikes and it was time to move on. Chock knew that if he continued to move through areas with active criminal elements, he would only draw more attention to himself. Federal agents were sniffing around everyone with even the slightest criminal record, looking for any lead on Pretty Boy Floyd. In an attempt to avoid any further entanglements with the underworld, he chose to relocate to a quieter city with little criminal activity, Buffalo in New York. There he hoped he could blend in and live quietly under an alias. On September the 16th, Chock and his companion Juanita, along with Ricchetti and Juanita's sister Rose, who had taken a liking to Adam, moved into the Amiantus building at 450 Rhode Island Street in Buffalo, overlooking 18th Avenue. They rented the whole second floor, which was large and furnished, with 5 rooms and a bathroom, all for a relatively cheap rent of $45 per month. The couples kept to themselves, remaining under the radar. They rarely ventured out, keeping their activities minimal. Their time spent at home consisted mostly of playing cards quietly, with no heated arguments. They kept a low profile in every way, subscribing to local newspapers and a few popular magazines. Chock and Adam Ricchetti read True Detective, while the women enjoyed Photoplay and Women's Home Companion. Their mail was sparse, no bills, no letters, just the occasional magazine. They didn't even own a telephone. Most of their meals were ordered in, and their lifestyle was one of isolation, seeking anonymity in a city that seemed far removed from their past lives. In this period of hiding, Chock took deliberate measures to keep his head down, knowing that any slip-up could mean a return to the life of constant evasion that had already defined his outlaw existence. The quiet of Buffalo, New York, however, was not to last. Meanwhile, in the halls of Washington, the Bureau of Investigation was growing stronger and more powerful. J. Edgar Hoover, emboldened by the national outrage following the Kansas City Massacre, was using the tragedy to push for sweeping changes that would enhance the FBI's ability to track down the country's most notorious criminals.
Hoover had convinced Congress to grant him the authority to pursue criminals across state lines and carry out arrests without the legal limitations that had previously bound his agents. The newly passed Fugitive Felon Act made escaping across state lines a federal crime, giving the FBI the power to act on any fugitive trying to flee the jurisdiction of local authorities. The agents were armed and would shoot to kill if necessary. Federal agents now had full protection and authority, and the agency was backed by the promise of up to $25,000 in rewards for information leading to the capture of criminals.
These changes were not just administrative. They were a clear signal that the FBI was now a force to be reckoned with, and its targets would find themselves under constant scrutiny. For men like Floyd, the new laws posed a direct threat. The agency now had the power to pursue criminals wherever they went, and Hoover's public denouncements of the nation's most wanted criminals ensured that every criminal knew they were on the Bureau's radar. Among the names on Hoover's infamous public enemies list were Chalk, along with notorious figures like John Dillinger, George Machine Gun Kelley, Babyface Nelson, and Bonnie and Clyde. These criminals were seen as public enemies, and Hoover had made it clear that they were to be hunted down at all costs. For Floyd, being placed on that list meant being hunted like an animal, but during the summer of 1934, his focus was not on the law, but on his own increasingly unbearable situation. The balance between staying hidden and the desire to act on his frustrations would soon reach a tipping point, and Chalk's next decision would be critical in determining how long his freedom would last. After 8 months of isolation, in May 1934, Chalk, restless and driven by a sense of impending doom, returned to Oklahoma with his partner, Adam Ricchetti, to visit their families. The trip, however, was overshadowed by the chilling news that Bonnie and Clyde had been ambushed and killed in a hail of bullets by Texas Rangers. The graphic photographs of the aftermath, dozens of bullet holes in their car, their bodies sprawled lifeless, filled the newspapers. The article also made it clear that John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd were the next targets for the federal authorities. While such threats had been made before, this time the gravity of the situation felt all too real.
On May the 13th, Chalk met with his mother on a secluded spot along a dirt road. The FBI had placed the entire Floyd family under constant surveillance, so this secret meeting was likely the last time that Chalk would ever see her. As he kissed her goodbye, he warned her that he might never return. He didn't know it at the time, but this would be Chalk's last meeting with his mother. His nephew, Glendon Floyd, would later recall the last moments that he spent with his uncle.
That I ever saw my uncle. I was coming down the old dirt road, and I was probably about 8 years old. And I got up close to him, and I was looking at him, and he was grinning. And got up close, and where I could see, here he was with his old straw hat and a pair of overalls and a silk undershirt. That's my uncle.
A few weeks later, Chalk, joined by Ricchetti, met John Dillinger and his gang in South Bend, Indiana, for a robbery at the Merchants National Bank at 229 South Michigan Street in Indiana. It was likely the last bank job the two infamous outlaws would commit together. On June the 30th, 1934, they entered the bank with guns drawn. Dillinger shouted, "This is a hold-up," whilst Chalk opened fire with his Thompson submachine gun, shooting into the ceiling to instill fear into the customers. As Dillinger and Floyd moved behind the teller counter to fill their bags with cash, Fatso Negri, another member of Dillinger's gang, herded the bank guards into a back room. Outside, a police officer, Officer Wagner, heard the gunfire and started towards the bank. Homer Van Meter, Dillinger's right-hand man, stationed outside, shot the officer dead before turning his attention back to the robbery. As the robbery progressed, the men knew they had to hurry. The sound of the rifle shots outside alerted them to the presence of a crowd, and the police were closing in. Floyd and Dillinger grabbed a couple of hostages to use as human shields as they made their escape. In the chaos, one of the hostages was wounded, and Van Meter was grazed by a bullet in the scuffle to get into the getaway car. With hostages still clinging to the car, the gang made a hasty exit from South Bend, never to return. The robbers released their hostages outside of town and vanished, taking only $4,800 from the heist, around $100,000 today. For Chalk, it was one of his final acts of defiance against the law. Less than 3 weeks later, John Dillinger would be dead, shot by FBI agents in Chicago.
Floyd's days were numbered. The law was closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up with him. His life of crime, once filled with bravado and excitement, was now nearing its tragic end. Floyd returned back to Buffalo and laid low for a while.
By October 1934, Chock Floyd had become the prime target for the FBI. With the death of John Dillinger, Chock was now #1 public enemy, the torchbearer of lawlessness in America. The pressure was mounting, and on October the 11th, a grand jury in Kansas City indicted both Chock and Adam Ricchetti for the murders of the policemen at the Kansas City Massacre. J. Edgar Hoover, determined to take down the remaining outlaws, vowed that Chock would be dead before Christmas. To accomplish this, Hoover put the legendary FBI agent Melvin Purvis in charge of bringing him down. Purvis, already celebrated for his role in John Dillinger's death, was a household name. As a polished, polite former lawyer, Purvis had become a national hero, admired for his relentless pursuit of criminals. Known for his good clothes, Purvis was a small man with a flair for the finer things in life, and his fame had made him a symbol of law enforcement in the 1930s. To Chock, the prospect of being hunted by Purvis was a grim reality, and he knew he had to act fast to avoid capture. Chock's plan was drastic, but perhaps the only option: flee to Mexico. But first, he wanted to gather his family and friends in Oklahoma and offer them the chance to escape with him. On October the 18th, Chock and his companions, Ricchetti, Juanita and Rose, left their Buffalo hideout under the cover of night, heading for the Cookson Hills in Oklahoma. As they drove through the night, they made their way south through New York, passing along the edge of Lake Erie and into Ohio. But disaster struck in the early hours of October the 19th. A thick fog descended upon the road south of Youngstown, and Chock, struggling to see through the haze, crashed the car into a telephone pole at a junction near Interstate 7 and the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. Although no one was injured, the crash left the car with a dented fender and a damaged radiator. As the car steamed and spluttered, Juanita and Rose searched for a mechanic while Chock and Ricchetti hid in the nearby woods. They weren't willing to take any chances after nearly being caught at the Bitzer garage in Bolivar. After a while, Juanita and Rose returned with a tow truck driver, and Chock gave them some money, instructing them to wait with the car, and returned once it was fixed.
Nothing to do but wait. Chock and Ricchetti stayed hidden in the woods, watching out for any sign of danger. They passed the hours in tense silence, constantly alert to any passing cars. Just after 10 a.m, 2 local men drove by and noticed the 2 men in suits lying by the side of the road. Their suspicious behaviour led the men to report them to the local police, and within moments, local police chief John Fultz,
along with 2 officers, approached the ridge where Chock and Ricchetti were hiding. When they saw the officers approaching, Ricchetti bolted into the woods, and Chock instinctively drew his gun. A gunfight ensued, with Chock firing at the police chief, narrowly missing him. The exchange of fire grew intense, but one of Chock's bullets hit the officer in the foot, causing him to stumble. Seizing the opportunity, Chock rolled down the steep incline of the ridge and escaped into the surrounding forest, narrowly avoiding capture. Despite the close call, Chock had managed to evade the law once again, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the net would tighten around him. With Melvin Purvis and the full weight of the FBI hunting him down, his options were dwindling, and his days of freedom were numbered. Chock Floyd's thoughts raced through his mind as he splintered through the dense Ohio woods. All he could think about was how he never had any luck in Ohio, and now, as he fled from the law, it felt as though the state was once again trying to trap him. During the gun battle, Ricchetti had been captured by the Wellsville police. After giving a false name and remaining tight-lipped, he was taken to the station for identification. Chief Fultz soon realised that the man they had in custody was none other than Pretty Boy Floyd's right-hand man, Adam Ricchetti. An all-points alert was sent out, and word of his capture quickly reached Melvin Purvis, who had been in Cincinnati on another case. Hoover immediately relieved Purvis of that assignment and sent him to Ohio to take charge of the manhunt. Purvis brought along his right-hand man, Herman Hollis, and arranged for additional agents to join the search. By 4 p.m, Purvis had arrived in Wellsville, where he met with Sheriff Ray Long of the Ohio State Patrol. They set up their base of operations at the local Travelers Hotel in East Liverpool, and soon agents from across the Midwest, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit and Chicago began to arrive to assist in the hunt. Roadblocks were set up, closing all exits from the area, while armed teams scoured Spencer Woods, the last known location where Chock had vanished.
Despite the rain, which fell relentlessly through Sunday night into Monday morning, the search continued. Melvin Purvis feared that Pretty Boy might have slipped through the net and found refuge in Youngstown, a known haven for criminals. But then a promising lead came in. A man reported having seen another man resembling Pretty Boy Floyd near the Bell Schoolhouse, about 10 miles east of East Liverpool.
The farmer described the man as a dishevelled figure, wearing a wrinkled, expensive suit that had been scratched by thistles and pine needles. He had a day's worth of stubble on his chin, and though the farmer hadn't recognised him, the description matched Floyd's wanted poster. Purvis and his agents followed up on the lead. As they were questioning the farmer, a posse of 4 Liverpool policemen, including Officer Chester K. Smith, a sharpshooter from World War I, pulled up alongside Purvis. The officers offered their assistance, and Purvis, confident they were closing in, instructed them to stay close. By Monday afternoon, October the 22nd, 1934, Chock was exhausted, soaked to the bone, and hungry. He had spent the entire day moving through the woods, and the only food he'd received since the previous day was from the farmer near the Bell Schoolhouse. As he peeked out from the dense cover of the forest, he saw a farmhouse sitting at the edge of a cornfield with more woods on the other side. The house looked harmless enough, and Chock, desperate for a meal, decided to make a break for it. His pocket watch read 3 p.m. He hadn't had a decent meal in over 24 hours, and the thought of food urged him to risk it. His situation had become desperate. For days, he'd been surviving on apples, pears and berries, his stomach gnawing with hunger, his mind muddled by dizziness from exhaustion. He knew he needed to get to Youngstown, but the journey had been so confusing, he couldn't tell east from west anymore. His mind, worn thin from the constant evasion, had lost its bearings. The FBI, local police, and even a low-flying scout plane had been hunting him, relentless in their pursuit. All he could think about now was finding a chair, a bite of food, and a cigarette, though he had no matches. As he cautiously emerged from the trees, he surveyed the road. It appeared deserted, except for 2 people working far off in the fields of a nearby farm. The road sign read Spruceville Road. Desperately seeking some help, Chock knocked on the screen door of the small grey house. The woman who answered, a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Conkle, listened to his request. "Ma'am, I'm hungry and lost," he told her. "Could you please spare something for my stomach? A little bread and a little meat would do me just dandy." Floyd told her that he had been out squirrel hunting, which she suspected was a lie, as he was in a full suit. People didn't turn people away from the door in those days, and despite her suspicions, thinking that the same man plastered on the front page of the newspapers was now the man at her front door, she invited him in and offered to fix him a meal. While Chock washed up, Mrs. Conkle prepared him a hearty meal: ribs, potatoes, rice, coffee, donuts, and pumpkin pie. After eating, he complimented her cooking, calling it a meal fit for a king, and insisted on paying her $1 for the meal. Mrs. Conkle mentioned that her brother, Mr. Dyke, owned a Model A Ford parked behind the corn crib, and if Chock needed a ride, he might be able to help.
By 4 p.m, Chock noticed Mrs. Conkle's brother returning from the fields. He introduced himself to Chock as Mr. Dyke and after a little persuasion, agreed to take Chock to Clarkson, the next town up the road. Dyke's wife was wary of the situation, but Mr. Dyke was eager to get going before nightfall. Chock climbed into the car, relieved to put an end to all the endless walking. The sound of the engine momentarily made him feel safe. In his mind, he was going to Clarkson to rest and plan his next move.
But as they neared the end of the road, Chock saw trouble. 2 cars appeared, their occupants eyeing him suspiciously. Chock's instincts screamed that the men in those cars were no strangers. Purvis and his agents were in the first car, and East Liverpool policemen were in the second. They had been stopping at every house on Spruceville Road, looking for Pretty Boy Floyd. When they saw Chock climbing into Dyke's Model A, they recognised him instantly. "That's our boy," Purvis shouted. Doors flew open and more than half a dozen agents and officers, armed with machine guns, shotguns and revolvers, poured out of the cars. Chock, his heart pounding, bolted from the car and ran towards the open field, instinctively reaching for his 4.5 automatic. The agents followed, their footsteps pounding behind him. Chock cut across the slope, but no matter how fast he ran, the woods seemed to move further away. His only thought was to escape into the woods, to keep running until the danger passed. Behind him, Purvis and the others shouted for him to surrender. Then, the unmistakable crack of a rifle echoed across the field. The shot, fired by Chester K. Smith, the sharpshooter, struck Chock in the right arm. The pain was intense and it threw him to the ground, but he didn't stop. He got back on his feet and kept running. The agents were closing in. Purvis gave the command to open fire, and Chock could hear the bullets flying through the air. The pain from the gunfire was unbearable, but Chock kept moving. He was not going back to prison. The wind whistled in his ears, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart and the rhythm of his feet against the grass. His body screamed for him to stop, but he couldn't. The sound of the gunfire rang out again, and the pain tore through him like 1,000 red-hot needles. Chock collapsed to the ground, hit by 3 bullets. As he lay there, he recognised the figure standing over him. Melvin Purvis, the man who had captured Dillinger. Purvis looked exactly as he had in the newspapers, shaven face, high cheekbones, intense eyes. "Were you at Kansas City?" Purvis asked, his voice steady. "No," was all Chock managed to say, tasting the blood on his lips. As his vision blurred, the taste of blood faded, replaced by the comforting scent of cotton. He could hear the faint sounds of birdsong from the trees above, and, for a moment, he imagined himself on horseback, riding towards the horizon. The weight of his fate seemed distant, as though he were riding towards an unknown destiny, far from the pain and the chaos of the present. But the moment was fleeting, and as the twilight deepened, Chock Floyd's fate was sealed. He was no longer the fugitive on the run, but a man at the mercy of the law. Charles Arthur Floyd died there, in this field, aged just 30 years old. Chock's body was moved from the field to the Sturgis Funeral Home at 122 West 5th Street in East Liverpool, which is now a bed and breakfast, but still has Floyd's death mask on the wall. His body was displayed here in a crushed velvet blanket, and Chock proved to be just as popular in death as he was in life. Over 20,000 people flocked to this funeral home to catch a glimpse of public enemy number 1. After Pretty Boy Floyd's death, his body was returned to Sallisaw, Oklahoma, the Cookson Hills, where he had grown up and where people still remembered him as their own. The funeral, attended by more than 40,000 people, was the largest funeral ever in Oklahoma's history and still is today. Every flower shop in a 20-mile radius of Sallisaw sold out of stock as the crowd flocked to Aikens Cemetery to watch Chock be laid to rest. He had achieved that folk hero status he had craved since his youth. While figures like bankers and lawmen may have felt relief at his passing, the majority mourned the loss of Floyd, seeing him as a local hero and protector. Juanita and Rose Baird, who had learned of Floyd's capture in Wellsville, Ohio, quickly made their way to Sallisaw after the car repairs were done. They arrived in time to attend Floyd's funeral, their grief reflective of many who had lost someone they considered one of their own. As for Ricchetti, the man involved in Floyd's criminal activities, he never tasted freedom again. He was returned to Kansas City, where he was convicted for his role in the infamous massacre, and despite requesting a second trial, he was found guilty and executed in the gas chamber on October the 17th, 1938. Ruby Floyd, Floyd's widow, and their son Dempsey continued on after his death, with Ruby even being paid by a movie company to promote the film Crime Doesn't Pay. She travelled and received press coverage for a while, but her subsequent marriages were less successful. She died in 1970. Dempsey, on the other hand, led a successful life. He graduated high school, served in World War II, and later became a businessman and father. He died in 1999 and kept his father's memory alive during his life, which was helped particularly through John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath and the song The Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd by Woody Guthrie. Despite his notorious life of a gangster, Pretty Boy Floyd was not only remembered for his crimes, he left behind a loyal and adoring public who saw past the violence and chaos he was known for. His family and close friends also knew the warm side of Floyd that the world often overlooked. On the first anniversary of his death, Adam Ricchetti and the Baird sisters paid tribute to him with a heartfelt poem published in the Kansas Star. We never knew what pain he had. We did not see him die. We only knew he passed away and did not say goodbye. We are thinking of you, Daddy dear, thinking of the past. You left behind some broken hearts that loved you to the last, that never did nor never will forget you, Daddy dear, and while you rest in peaceful sleep, your memory we shall always keep.
The poem captured the depth of affection and loss that those who truly knew Pretty Boy Floyd felt when he was killed, far from the media perspective of this famous gangster.
For them, he was a man of warmth, a protector, and a father who left a legacy that would never be forgotten. But for many, he was a ruthless killer and bank robber. His legacy is one that will forever dance on the line between hero and villain.
Thanks so much for watching, and please do like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed the tale of Pretty Boy Floyd. It was certainly a fascinating one, and one that I felt immersified in as well, if that's a word. Listen, I know the format for this documentary has been a little different with me being on camera, but I really do need to avoid those copyright strikes. So unfortunately, I'm just going to have to limit the TV shows and movies that I can use to help tell the story. Thanks so much once more for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.